Hey, Peter.
Dude, hey.
Did you play more Octopath Traveler this weekend?
Yeah, it felt like I played a lot longer than I actually did. I'm finding the game, I like it,
Yeah.
but it's taking me a while to really get into it.
That's how I felt. I think I'm about 35 hours in, but as far as what we are allowed to talk about for the preview part or whatever, I've got all the characters, the main characters, out of the 8, obviously, Octopath, but you and I were talking about, we both like it, but there are a lot of flaws with it, at least so far, and it's kind of hard to say why we like it until you really think about it.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it, I can certainly nail very specific aspects, but the main thing I keep coming back to that I keep struggling with is the fact that I have not yet hit a story or a plot that really ties all these characters together and justifies why we're going on these adventures in the bigger picture. Like, I know that I can play as a huntress who's looking for her lost master and stuff like that makes sense for each individual character, but the rest of it I'm kind of just like going along waiting for something to happen.
Yeah, it's cool how it's structured as far as you can get them in any order you want, but the world itself is a ring for the most part, so then you can get, like I started with the huntress and then I went down to get Therian the thief and then Elfin the apothecary, but the problem I have with the writing, as much as I like the structure, is that even when you already have 3 characters or 4 characters, when you go and recruit the next one and you do not just their origin story, which they all do by themselves, but the actual beginning of their quest as a group, they don't acknowledge that they have 7 companions.
No, and they get together on the thinnest pretenses. Basically, like you join them mid-conversation after a fade to black. You're supposed to just assume the conversation began between your 2 parties, and then you just say, yeah, I'll help you out. Yeah. And that's about it. So many games that this is meant to, evoke the spirit of, right? Like, say Final Fantasy VI, obviously Seiken Densetsu is, the sequel to Secret of Mana is a big one. But so many of those games, you meet characters organically through, going through a bigger plot. So the fact that this is such a mechanical, rigid way of building your party and getting the story started, that's got me feeling a little skeptical.
Yeah.
But that aside, I'm really loving the combat first and foremost.
Yeah, definitely. The combat, I was trying to describe it. Obviously, there's a designer and a producer from the Bravely Default and Bravely Second, that series. They are working on here, so you can kind of, if you play those games, you can imagine how you can save up battle points to boost, essentially like unleash these all-out attacks. You can save up 5, but you can only use 4 at a time, I believe. And then you can just unload a lot of damage on people if you've been patient for previous turns.
Yeah, and it's different from the Bravely games because you're not sacrificing a turn to then have multiple moves in the future turn. It's like, literally, as long as you don't spend battle points, you'll earn another 1 for the next round.
Yeah.
And the critical mechanic that all this plays into is breaking your enemy, essentially disrupting their place in the order of who goes next. Vulnerabilities are a big deal. The game makes it very clear, like, what can damage an enemy, but you have to figure that out. But once you know, then it's all about, okay, when is their turn next? What options do I have in my party to disable them before their turn comes? That can be easier said than done. Bosses at this point are starting to ramp up and have like a shield of 7 points, which means I need to hit them with 7 of something they're vulnerable with. To be able to even break them in the first place.
That's where the boosting gets interesting because you can save up the boost for when they are stunned and they're going to take more damage.
But sometimes you want to spend all of it though just to get them broken.
Yeah, especially when you fight bosses where it's like 10 shields and they're vulnerable. I almost said allergic. They're vulnerable to bow and arrows and spears. So one character's bow and arrow, you hit them with all of your boosts, so that'll bring the shields down to 5. And then you stun them, and then you have like my scholar. Cyrus, he is pretty much my damage dealing character in general with elemental attacks, so then I'll just like unleash Firestorm on them once they're stunned. But I like the dynamic between that. If people who played Persona 5 might be sort of familiar with once you stun everybody on the enemy team, you can do an all-out attack. That's not the case here, but each individual character can essentially do an all-out attack.
Right, I mean, once an enemy is broken, every hit is essentially a critical hit. I am finding I'm not sure that I like the fact that magic, when you boost it, isn't increasing the number of magic hits. It's just sort of increasing the strength of the magic.
Yeah.
And like weapons, some enemies are vulnerable to different types of magic. So you really have to pick and choose like how you're piling on the attacks. It gives you a lot to think about.
Yeah. Because like to mention Cyrus, he gets attacks that are like you can deal lightning, fire, or ice damage to everybody twice. That's the most I've seen that you could do with magic. Outside of, like you said, boosting doesn't increase the number of times you hit.
Right.
But it does kind of, I sort of like it because it makes me think about Magic differently, which you already do anyway, though. I guess I would like it if it actually was a quantity of hits. And then, yeah, like I like how all the different classes complement each other. I thought the Merchant might be boring, and I thought the Apothecary might be boring, but I think Elfin the Apothecary is my favorite character in combat outside of the Huntress, who I picked. His concoctions, you can essentially cure any status ailments, and then when you unlock more jobs, he's kind of a light medic, but he's more of like a triage first aid, kind of get rid of poison, like wake someone up without using an item.
But he's also a bit of a tank, because like one of his support skills that you unlock semi-early on is a huge boost to his HP.
Yeah.
So like the classes and the characters feel very distinct from one another, certainly. So while I'm not necessarily in love with them outside of combat, everyone really has their own value, even though if like at first I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this character, this archetype, they have some skill that makes them really valuable.
Yeah, and like over time, obviously, like I really, I'd mentioned it earlier, but despite the fact that I have a lot of problems with the writing itself and the dialogue and how most of the characters are presented, I really like how the world is structured. As far as you're recruiting the 8 characters, it's just a ring, sort of. So again, you can go counterclockwise, you can go clockwise, and gameplay-wise, it accounts for that. Again, like the story might not as well, but after that, you start branching outward into like a second level of the spiral to do their the second phase of all their quests. And like you said, there's no problem I have is there's no unifying story. They just like, you know, supposedly you're supposed to assume these 7 people are helping Hanit find her master. And so when you go do that, that's the only story you're focusing on. Or these 7 people are helping Alphen travel the world to help people in medical need.
But so far there's no sort of discussion among them themselves, right? The only inter-party interactions you get are that moment when they join forces, and it's the most thin agreement of cooperation.
Yeah, and supposedly there is like contextual dialogue later while you're traveling.
Yeah.
I haven't encountered that yet, but I don't even think that would account for the fact that like when you, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Olberic, the warrior, when you go to fight the people with him, everybody's like, you're gonna go do this by yourself? But then in my head, I'm like, no, I have 6 other people recruited, what are they talking about? It doesn't account for that, and I kind of wish more time had gone into making everything feel contextual. I do like some of the characters a lot. I like Alphen, he's endearing, and then, you know, like later on his story develops in a different way, but it's also, because there's 8 different stories, it feels so up and down. Like, I love Hanit for combat, but the writing in Swarky, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but her hometown is just so high fantasy, like using this, go into the forest.
Yeah.
罠には引っかからんし、時々俺の動きを読んでいる気もする。知能が高いのか、勘がいいのか、なかなか尻尾をつかませてくれる。
It's a bit of a chore to read and get through all of that. And that's kind of what I feel like I'm doing is I'm completing chores by collecting these characters. You know, a full party in combat is 4.
Yeah.
And I almost, once I hit my 4th character, I almost thought like, do I just sort of push the boundaries and continue on to chapter 2 for the characters I have already recruited and not even bother with the ones that I haven't met? I'm curious if that's possible with this game. I'm gonna recruit them all because I gotta see what they're all like.
I'd say if you grind enough, it would be possible, but I do think the game does a good job of giving you enemies in certain areas that certain characters are way better against. Like say, if you don't have Therion the Thief or Cyrus, then enemies with only a fire weakness are gonna be tougher because you don't have fire attacks. So while
but if you have the hunter, she can get enemies. She can capture enemies that have a fire element.
Yeah, she's got like a Pokemon Light aspect to her, kind of. You get a limited time use with her.
Essentially a blue mage in Final Fantasy. Speak.
As a game that's clearly like playing on nostalgia. I mean, there's more to it than that, obviously, from what we've said. But visually, in terms of its structure, as you know, like an old school JRPG, it's clearly playing on, like, riffing on those old tropes. Do you think it's to its detriment so far, or do you think it's a really good homage with its own little twists on the formula?
I mean, I think it's a good homage. Like I am missing the broader epic story, so I'm hoping that comes. You know, if you really just want to talk about the presentation of the game, it really nails the PlayStation era mix of pixelated 2D textures and simple 3D models. It's this sort of thing that reminds me of Xenogears or Breath of Fire 3 and 4. I'm finding myself marveling at the sort of visual effects that go into making this pixel art so attractive, and it's a dreamy game. You know, it's very soft. There's a lot of things that are out of focus to create depth of field.
There's like almost always a vignette around the edge of the screen.
Yeah,
especially when
that's the
you're
word that's what I was looking for. I mean, that is what they're going for, and you know, sometimes with the somewhat dull writing and that, I find myself getting a little sleepy playing this. Like if it's not a really exciting moment. But I like the fact that they've experimented in this way. I do find myself thinking that the character sprites are a little bit too small. But
Yeah.
the enemies, and particularly the bosses, have this wonderful level of detail and sort of like grim little twists. They may look like at one point you fight like a deranged rat-looking thing, which in the overworld just looks kind of innocuous. But in the game, it's got this very sort of like fiendish pose, and it's drooling from the mouth, and you can really tell its eyes are crazy.
And that goes back to like how they did Kefka in Final Fantasy VI, right?
Yeah, it's that same sort of just exaggerated, like grandiose representation, which looks great. Like I really like that a lot.
Yeah, despite like the numerous flaws I'm seeing with it, it's reminding me of the Bravely games in the sense that I'm still having a ton of fun with it. But the game comes out in about a week and a half-ish time. Seems fairly long from as far as I've gotten. We can't talk too much more past that point, but I'm excited about it so far. Excited to see what other people think.
Yeah, I really hope that if I put a little bit more time into this, that I'll find a story that matches all the excellent stuff around it. Because so far this game shows a lot of promise. Just might take a while to really get there and show it off.
Yeah. Well, get back to work. You have to review it. I don't.
All right.